House to agree with the Commons in their Amendment 25.
I may, by first of all thanking the noble Baroness, Lady Neville Rolfe. I'll turn back to that remark again in a few moments' time because she has been extraordinarily helpful, and I know we've made significant progress from when the First Amendment was moved on this issue. But in parenthesis, before I begin, I would really like to say, because I won't weary the House with a second speech later, even if the opportunity were there, to say how much I support what the noble Lord Hunt of King's Heath is trying to achieve with Amendments 102A and 102B. And again, I've spoken on those previously, along with the noble Baroness Lady Northover, the noble Baroness Lady Brinton, my noble friend Baroness Finlay, who is unable to be with us this evening, Lord Ribeiro from the Conservative benches, and many others who want to support what the noble Lord is trying to achieve. But, my Lords, let me turn then to Clause 65 and the amendment in my name, and the motion 47A and 47B. And as the noble Baroness has said to us, it would require a timeline for the removal of surveillance equipment that is connected to the internet and subject to the People's Republic of China's national intelligence law. Now, I did say that I would like to start my remarks, and I do, by paying tribute to the noble Baroness's own efforts and those of her officials who have met with me now on several occasions, most recently on Thursday last, to discuss the concerns of members of both houses when it comes to the presence of Chinese-made surveillance cameras in our public procurement chain. As recently as yesterday, my Lords, the Sunday Telegraph reported that the Co-op has decided to ban Chinese CCTV for, and I quote, ethical and security reasons. And given the noble Baroness's own professional background in a previous life, the Minister will know that in doing this they are following the example of Tesco. My Lords, it would indeed be odd if supermarkets were ahead of public bodies in recognising the dangers posed by the CCP's surveillance state. I might also say that I was very struck that the Deputy Prime Minister, speaking in another place this afternoon about allegations concerning espionage on the estate of your Lordship's house and that of another place, that the Right Honourable Oliver Dowden made a point of saying that one of his first actions in Whitehall had been to have surveillance cameras linked to Hikvision removed from his department, something that Sajid Javid also said when he became Secretary of State for Health. And I would simply say to your Lordships that if supermarkets and departments of state are not suitable places for these cameras, well, where is? My Lords, it would indeed be odd if we didn't think about the 60% of public bodies that are estimated to have Hikvision cameras in use. And indeed, this is not a new question that I've put to your Lordship's House. It's something I've raised on over 40 occasions in the House or in committee since 2020. Now, both the Minister and the Leader of the House, Lord True, have taken this issue seriously. When the noble Lord True was in charge of this bill, when it was in its earliest stages, we had a meeting to discuss Hikvision. And because I want to get on with seeing a resolution of this issue, I am able to welcome the clear commitment from the Minister given at the dispatch box for a timetable for the removal of this surveillance equipment and these cameras from sensitive sites. It is worth noting, though, as I've said, how we got here. As the government's recognised, there are at least 1 million Hikvision and Dahua cameras across the UK, installed across our high streets, our job centres, schools, police forces, hospitals, universities, local government buildings and even government departments. And I would just gently say to the noble Baroness that although she is right that military barracks or GCHQ are clearly far more sensitive sites than, say, hospitals or schools, some of this is about data collection, and that involves every single citizen of this country, so it poses dangers for them too. And I would commend to her the recent Channel 4 documentary on Hikvision and the fantastic work of IPVM, of Big Brother Watch, Hong Kong Watch, of which I'm a patron, and others that have outlined the security risks that these cameras pose, particularly in those sensitive public sector sites, but not exclusively so. It's quite something to consider that as a country we've willingly handed over the majority of our surveillance infrastructure that watches the often public and sometimes intimately private moments of our lives, not just to the police or to local authorities, but to an authoritarian government but the House of Commons has found on a resolution of that House that is credibly accused of genocide. I declare a non-financial interest as Vice Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on the Uyghurs. How ironic it is that we're debating this motion today on the day that we've learnt that an alleged CCP spy has been operating across Parliament and based in the office of a member of another place. We urgently need a bicameral group of senior parliamentarians to investigate this shocking lapse. The Intelligence and Security Committee of the House of Commons has warned against the infiltration of our universities and other institutions. And only last week, the University of Cambridge ended a partnership with a subsidiary company developing Chinese weapons and military hardware. The line between crass naivety and outright collaboration is a fine one. And we recall the Cambridge spies and the Soviet Union and some of the disastrous consequences. It should send a shiver down the spine of every freedom-loving person to see swathes of the public surveillance procurement supply chain handed over to Chinese companies that are blacklisted for complicity in gross human rights violations by the United States and who are legally compelled under the PRC national intelligence law to pass on data to the Chinese Communist Party state. As we debate the timeline for their removal from our public procurement supply chain, the definition of what we should consider sensitive sites and the oversight members of this House and another place that we will have should be high on our agenda. My Lords, the answer surely is that for too long, the government policy towards China has favoured investment and trade at the expense of our national security, our values and human rights. We've underestimated the PRC, ignored the voices of those Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, Tibetans and others who've been persecuted by the CCP and know them best, and failed to produce a coherent strategy to deal with the threat that the PRC poses. I'm always struck by the phrase that the noble Lord Patton of Barnes, who knows a thing or two about China, uses. He describes it as cakeism, as wanting to have your cake and eat it, wanting to have trade deals on one hand, but recognising a country as a threat to your national interests on the other. My Lords, despite the ongoing human rights crackdown in Hong Kong, China's flagrant breaches of the Sino-British Joint Declaration and the recent targeting of Hong Kong activists living in the UK, the government has failed to hold any Hong Konger or Chinese official to account with targeted sanctions. And I suppose at this juncture I should say that I have a sort of interest in being one of two members of your Lordship's House who have been sanctioned by the CCP. Most ministers would privately concede, if pushed, that they share the view of this House that the treatment of Uyghur Muslims is credibly genocide, yet they dare not publicly state it or take the kind of actions that the US is taking to ensure the goods that we import from China are not made by Uyghur forced labour. And that's why I raised that very issue, linking it not just to slave labour, but also to genocide in the original amendment that I moved. Last week, with the Noble Baroness, Lady Kennedy of the Shores, and Sir Ian Duncan-Smith MP, who has championed this cause in the Commons, I met with US Customs and Border Protection officials to discuss customs enforcement preventing goods coming to the US from China's Uyghur region, where forced labour is present. And it's striking how much the US is doing to tackle the issue of modern slavery in comparison to our own, I think, rather lacklustre approach. These views aren't mine alone, but shared by the Foreign Affairs Committee in its recent report on the Indo-Pacific, and also the Integrated Review and the Joint Intelligence and Security Committee report on China, which both bemoan the woeful lack of a China strategy and seriousness from the government over the security threats posed by the PRC. I commend to the Minister last week's op-ed by Juliet Samuel, where she made a forensic examination of what she described as the King Kowtow approach to trade with China, where incidentally, instead of resilience, we have a huge dependency and a trade deficit of over £40 billion. Procurement and renewal of our own industrial capacity would make a dent in that. We need a national resilience strategy, not dependency. Surely that's one of the lessons that we should have learnt from Ukraine. Sadly, the Foreign Secretary's recent visit to Beijing reflects the wrong approach. He's embarked on a fixed pathway of engagement with the PRC at all costs, failing to protect our national security at home, and unwilling to learn the lessons from our key allies who have far more developed strategies for dealing with the PRC. My Lords, the commitment by the government this evening won't change consecutive governments' woeful lack of a China policy overnight, but it does offer a glimmer of hope for the publication of a timeline for the removal of what the former Biometrics and Surveillance Camera Commissioner has described, and I quote, as digital asbestos from our public procurement supply chain. The government should reflect on the worrying reasons for the resignation of Professor Fraser-Sampson, the Commissioner. When it comes to the government's commitment to prioritise the removal of this equipment from sensitive sites, which I welcome, I favour the clearest definition to cover our police forces, NHS trusts, schools, universities, government departments, military sites, transport networks and local government buildings. This clear definition will make it easier for the government to readily identify the extent of the problem and put in place a practical timetable for the removal of surveillance equipment which falls under the jurisdiction of the PRC National Intelligence Law after 6 months of this bill receiving royal assent. And I welcome the commitment from the government for a role. I think this is the most important thing of all in the concessions that the government have offered, for a role for members of this House and the other place to scrutinise annually the progress the government has made in the removal of these cameras, this equipment, and hope that the responsibility for this will be given to the Joint Intelligence and Security Committee. Finally, it's my sincere desire that we can avoid such a public procurement supply chain fiasco in the future. I hope that civil servants and ministers will learn the lessons from allowing Hikvision and Dahua cameras to spread across the public sector and avoid such a costly mistake for the taxpayer in the future. I started my speech by paying tribute to the Noble Baroness Lady Neville-Rolfe and the departmental officials who've worked on this bill, and I'd like to end it in that spirit as well. I greatly appreciate the concerted engagement from the Minister, the quiet diligence of officials and the openness of the government to move on this important issue. And in conjunction with that, I also thank Sam Goodman of Hong Kong Watch, of which I am a patron, as I've said, with some of his helpful background work. Given the commitment today by the Minister at the dispatch box to the publication of a timeline, a definition of sensitive sites and the allowance of some parliamentary oversight, I'll not be moving this amendment to a division, but, my Lords, the House can be sure I'll watch this with an eagle eye and return to it should the need arise in the future.
I'm going to speak to